Hello, Garland Nixon here, and going to have a great time on a Thursday night. I got my buddy Matt Ehret. Matt, welcome to my humble channel.
Hey, thank you for having me on, Garland.
I think you're really going to enjoy it. We got a lot to talk about. We're going to have a big discussion about the system, how we got here, and what's going on. Let's talk. Well, I want to thank everybody for coming. Matt Ehret. Matt is a journalist, lecturer. He's a founder of the Canadian Patriot Review and the Rising Tide Foundation. He's an author. He's been on the Duran company, written for the Duran, Fort Russ, the LA Review of Books, China Channel. He's been published in Asia Times, Global Times, Oriental Review, Zero Hedge, all over the place. And the Duran, wow, I just had Alexander McCorris on last week. Certainly happy to have you on, Matt.
Cool. It's a pleasure to be on.
Great. Let me throw something at you. Something I was thinking about the other day, and I just thought I'd get your thoughts on it. I noticed something. People talk about there's no way to vote your way out of it, and I refer to the two parties in the U.S. as, a couple of brainwashed cults, right? And or I'll say there's one party and, they've got a few minor social differences, right? But I realized something. Bojo and Keir Starmer if you look at the Tories and Labour in the UK, if you look at the Greens and the Christian Democrats or whatever in Germany, if you look throughout the West, what they've been able to do is create the illusion of more than one party, but in reality, the only selection you have are basically the same people doing the same things. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I'm speaking to you from Canada, which is a parliamentary party system by its definition. It is intrinsically, the party system is something I believe personally is a fraudulent type of way to organize society. The idea that you can have people thinking in terms of like a sports game with their party versus another party, where you don't really have a sense of an individual who can play a leading role outside of some party formula that they have to adapt to. And if they don't, they have a party whip to keep them in the line. And in the context of like a Canadian parliamentary or British parliamentary democracy, so-called, if you do stand for your conscience as a member of, let's say, the Liberal or NDP or Conservative, whatever, if you have your conscience compels you to stand against your party's program on any point, you're effectively kicked out. You're booted out of your party. Your career is over. The difference being when you compare that to a Republican system in principle. Now, I mean, admittedly, the U.S. Republican system has fallen quite far into this parliamentary party type of corruption. But when it works in its proper sense, and it has, I could see examples historically, you as an individual can stand for your conscience and you won't be kicked out. You can be, let's say you're a Republican, your party, let's say, votes to bomb a country halfway around the world. If you don't agree with that, you can stand up for your conscience. And you can put into words to organize your constituency and other constituencies using the platform, ideally, of a relatively uncorrupted media. And this, again, only works when you have a cultural level which is astute enough to use wisdom and to cut through I don't know if I can curse, but bull crap,
Certainly.
If you have that, then certainly it is useful to be able to have that platform and not risk your career being flushed down the toilet. I think today we have a problem where everyone just thinks in terms of, my team versus another team. And to the degree that they do that and they wait for one team to win out, they miss the fact that all teams, all sides, like you said, are all being taken over by agencies that are above any particular nation state and don't care about our interests. So all sides seem to be moving in the same convergent direction, which is not in anybody's benefit.
So let me ask you about that.
Mm,
And I guess we had to get there. One of the things I know Max Blumenthal very well. He's here in the DC area, and he recently covered the Bilderberg Commission and the Bilderberg meeting, and that's part of the
yeah.
discussion because when he talked about the people that were here, the king of some country, and former CIA chiefs and former chairs of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and these people of power throughout the system, you realize that it's exactly what you're saying. The people that we see, the mask is Joe Biden and Bojo, but that ain't the monster behind the mask. So
No.
what are your thoughts on when people discuss, like Joe Biden? Clearly he's had better days, let's just put it like that. But and then the question is, there's somebody pushing the buttons. Who's pulling the strings and pushing the buttons? What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, you're going straight for the nerve center.
Going straight
Okay.
to it, man.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think we don't really have a lot of time, eh? We are at the end of a system, and things could get very ugly very fast. So it's good not to beat around the bush. I do believe that there is a top-down, organized, oligarchical system above nation states, which organizes itself in the form of um, degrees of power with a certain type of executive control center, which I don't even believe is in the United States itself. Okay,
Right.
I in my analysis, looking at the broader continuity of history, I think that from what I can see is that the older noble family, they call them noble, they're not very noble. The older hereditary castes that go back to the days of the British Empire, the Venetian Empire, before that, and even before that to the days of the Roman Empire, the Roman Senate, and the higher governing structures that managed the priesthoods, that managed the cults, that provided the licenses to which cults could operate to manage the culture of both the elites, the managers, as well as the masses in the Roman imperial system, have changed their costumes, they've changed their techniques, but ultimately there's a certain continuity of many of the same families. Some families get weakened and go and are booted out for new ones. Some of the families, though, have maintained a stronger lineage, a stronger power structure. And I think that above many of the hierarchies of upper level managers, whether it's the World Economic Forum as sort of a junior partner to Davos, to the Bilderberger Group. World Economic Forum was created under a different name in 1971 by a protege of Henry Kissinger from Harvard named Klaus Schwab, but it was patronized. It was funded, and one of the key sponsors was Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands. He funded the first 5 or 6 Davos forums back in the early 70s. Prince Bernhard was the founder of the Bilderberg Group in 1954. So these are simply committee bodies that organize and cohere a broader policy, which has always been defined around a couple of points, but I think the primary one is get rid of the institution of sovereign nation states that emerged in the wake of the Golden Renaissance of Europe. That was a new type of way of organizing society. Instead of having, human talking cows living under a feudal lord's estate, which was the previous way that things had been done by and large before that moment of the Renaissance. Ultimately, by doing that, remove the ability for human beings to wield the type of political and economic power needed to defend themselves against the rapaciousness of that same oligarchical caste. Reduce the population to something a little bit more manageable than 8 or 9 billion. And in so doing, also dumb down, reduce the cognitive power and cultural level of the population so that they don't know how to use the mind that God gave them for any useful end. So that they're just satisfied with drugs, video games, maybe metaverse, things like that. And I think that those are sort of the consistencies that then work themselves down in a system that's highly complex, compartmentalized, so that you have a highly specialized system where everybody in every department, whether the OECD, whether the UN, they don't understand what the whole system that they're a part of is doing. They're trained to be hyper compartmentalized and hyper specialized, so that only a small grouping of an executive needs to understand what the whole system is, what the machine does, and how the parts work together. And that's how this type of conspiracy works, in opposition to those naive views of conspiracy theories we see from things like Fight Club,
Right.
Where everybody's in on it. And it's not like that.
Well, very interesting. And so, I never thought about what you said, but when we think of the nation state, when we think of the way that our society is organized right now, it seems to us, because our lifespan is short, that it's been this way for 1,000 years, but it hasn't been this way for very long at all. A lot of these borders were redrawn even in the 1950s and 60s, when countries, and 70s, when some of the colonial countries were getting ostensibly free from colonialism. I've recently learned, in talking to people and traveling and talking to people in other lands and people of significant power in other lands, that I thought that some of that colonial stuff was over. But when I see how France still has like 40 of the top major ports in Africa, France still controls those. When I see France going over something in their former colonies of Lebanon, and I see when there's a problem, Macron's going over there saying, I'm going to handle it and I'm going to fix it. And I'm like, well, isn't that a sovereign nation? Holy moly. They were once a French colonial. And I realized that, again, they wanted to create the illusion that these countries had broken free of colonialism while still maintaining control of all of the levers of power and giving them the ability to extract the natural resources and the finances of these countries. Your thoughts?
Oh yeah, you hit it out of the park. That's exactly it. I mean, there are these nominally sovereign nation states, nominally, but while political independence was won and a lot of blood was a lot of people died for the sake of these freedom struggles. Unfortunately, much of the means to give meaning to that political sovereignty were never actualized, despite the better intentions of great people throughout the 1950s and 60s who worked very hard to gain economic full spectrum independence, to have national banking, people like Nasser, people, like Patrice Lumumba, people like Kwame Nkrumah. I mean, the list goes on. It's a long list of people who are either targeted for assassination by the CIA, by MI6, by French intelligence, or by coup d'etats, also orchestrated by agencies and counter gang operations within various countries. Whether we're talking Kenya, whether we're talking South American countries, we have all sorts of examples of this sort of thing. Where when you look at those who are killed or toppled, and look at their policies, they're fighting for getting economic independence, the right to have industrial independence, so that they're not dependent upon a stronger power to provide for them, to be free of economic usury by great financial centers like the IMF or the World Bank. And so the means to actualize, again, the ends of true independence were never provided. It was always sabotaged. And so we've come to a situation now, 60, 70 years into that process, where the argument is often being made that, but they're too underdeveloped to possibly properly govern themselves on their own, because, they had 80 years of independence and look where they're at. Look at the third world, how, it's unfortunate. And so you've got this patronizing racist type of policy masquerading as virtue, like, we care for them. We want to provide, some aid, some Western US aid or something to help these countries and give them appropriate technologies. Some of these people in Africa might have thought that they could have access to their oil or coal, or God forbid, nuclear resources, nuclear energy. But we know that is contrary to their natural ecological harmony. And so we should provide them windmills and solar panels that are appropriate technologies for their low level expectations and normal ways of doing things, that doesn't disrupt their lifestyle too much of being tribal people. And it's like, no, these countries at different points in civilization's history were far more advanced than the West was, than Europe was. Look at Africa in the 15th century. There's amazing signs of architecture and beautiful sculptures indicating a very advanced civilization, far more advanced than anything in Europe at that same time, coming out of Nigeria. And that's all been scrubbed out by the colonial powers who've tried to convince these people that, no, you're just inferior culturally or even genetically than the superior colonizers. And that's just, unfortunately, your lot in life, And so, yeah, empire is really just there. And the idea that we have to supersede the nation state system, which is just so inherently selfish, corrupt, unwieldy to the higher interests of humanity, in favor of a global governance architecture that could properly bring human beings as a whole into some harmony with nature, the way the Davos crew tries to say we have to do it under a great reset. it's bunk. It's you cut off the legs of people running at the race, and then you say, oh, we told you they couldn't run the race, but it's like you cut off their legs. Like, what are you doing?
It seems to me that there's some problems that they've run into, and let me throw this out there because I think I hear what you're saying, and it seems to me that they introduced this nation state system, and at some point they said we don't like this, we want to go back to a feudalism, but not a local feudalism with like city states, not a local feudalism with France and Germany having their kings and queens. We want kind of a worldwide feudalism, right?
Yeah.
And it seems to me that one of the issues they're having, and you see this to me with the censorship, is during traditional feudalism, you kept a lot of people ignorant, unable to read and write, unable to learn. One of the problems that they're having, and this is the censorship to me, is people are learning stuff. People are having the kind of conversations that we're having. And that is their big problem. I see the US and I say, people say, well, look at the terrible things our government does. And I say, the only way they can really get away with it is because they lie to the American people. Because if the American people knew the truth of what their government is doing, they'd reject it because they're normal people. And overall, people aren't psychopaths and sociopaths. And if they were told the absolute truth, this is what we're doing and this is why we're doing it, they would have to reject it. So what do you think about my thoughts that the people in power are struggling to try to make us stupider, to try to censor, a big problem they have is people know too much, they're learning too much, and they're getting hip to them. And I think that's like their biggest problem.
Yeah, I think that you're again, I couldn't disagree with anything you said. And I think that, when you look at one of the methods of empire, oligarchical structures of feudal empires, historically, one of the techniques that seems to come up as a constancy is the tendency to get the target victim population to become as sensualized as possible. Like in the case of Rome, for example, people know of the bread and circuses, right? The free flowing wine. 200 plus days of the year became festivals at the peak of the empire, such that in the capital you had to have a highly decadent, bloated, over-bloated, unmoral population that would get off watching people getting ripped to shreds by lions, and that were hyper sensualized, so that they didn't ask any questions about is this a viable way of life, such that we're not being very productive. The abundance that we're enjoying is coming from the rapaciousness and the slave labor colonies on the outskirts of the empire, of subjugating other people on the outskirts that have to then become the slave labor colonies that feed the capital. So people weren't asking questions. They weren't getting uppity. They were more inclined to just like embrace their slavery, kind of like an early version of what Aldous Huxley says needs to be created, as far as a concentration camp of the mind, where you give people sensual gratification, feelies, soma, other forms of gratification, so that you might threaten to take away their if their spiritual cage is removed from them, they will kind of almost rebel to keep themselves in their cage. Part of it too, I think, is this question of when you're centralized, you believe in your senses as being the cause of reality. That is not true, though. Like, this cup doesn't just come as a cup from the store. Like, people who are dumbed down, the way the empire has dumbed us down through our education and culture, is people tend more and more to think of object fixation, right? They're like, this cup comes from the store, my cereal comes from the store. They don't think about the entire interdynamic process of physical reality that produces the grain. Where does the grain come from? How does it ship? How is it processed? Where's the manufacturing centers that make this useful, or a resource that make the ceramic cup, right? What about the machine tools that have to be capital intensive machine tools to produce consumer goods, right? Machines that make machines. What people don't think about that reality. And yet when you look at or you listen to a beautiful speech like Martin Luther King Jr., where on many of his speeches, he would talk about the complex dependency of all humankind. And he describes getting up in the morning and taking a sip of coffee. And he goes through in an elegant, poetic, simple way that anybody can understand how you just engage with like millions of people around the world. The beings from Kenya or Colombia, and he just paints a beautiful elementary school picture of what should be basic economic like economics 101 elementary fact that unfortunately, even by the time in our corrupt day and age, by the time you get your PhD in macroeconomics, most people have not even gotten that lesson under their belt. They're just stuck in mathematical models of the way monetary theory is supposed to work, or how price analysis is supposed to work. And they haven't thought about the basic parameters of reality that support life. They don't know about that. So they go along with things that are ultimately destroying their own children, their own future selves, their nation. And they seem to be smart people. They can read. They've got degrees. And yet they can't seem to identify the basic, simple causes of their own destruction, you know? And that's it. It's the corruption of the mind.
Well, I'm glad you said that. That's going to take me into the current crisis that we have, right? Because it appears that we have the ultimate dual crisis, a crisis and an elite ruling class that's unable to deal with the crisis, right?
Yeah.
But here's my question, because I, following everything. So in Europe, what's happened with Ukraine, and the European leaders are like, we've got to strike out at Putin, and they're doing all these things that is wiping out their own economies. And I was looking today, so the Polish people have supported now they're on the border of Russia. They get their energy from Russia. They get all kinds of things from Russia, but they hate Russia. Interestingly, I guess they're taught to hate Russia. So they hate Russia. So they are at the forefront of the move to stop getting gas and all their energy from Russia. Okay, so the Poles are they're telling the rest of Europe, what's wrong with you? Why won't you cut off Russia? Are you crazy? They must suffer, right? Okay. So they cut off Russia. The Poles are now having mass protests, people in the street that are upset because of the price of gas. Now, the majority of the people support the policy, which is making their life currently a living hell. There were just articles where the government has now told people in Poland, you can go out in the woods and forage for wood. They're back to knuckle dragging Stone Age times. But at the same time, look at this contradiction. Exactly what you said. They're in the streets protesting the government because the price of energy. They can't put one and one together and come up with, we're supporting a policy that creates that. And you see that all throughout Europe. And a lot of us looked at that when it first started and we're like, guys, I think we know how this movie ends. You're going to be screwed. And it's just like the Europeans were in this frenzy of anger and they couldn't get it. And it's slowly starting to creep in because reality's beating them over the head. So your thoughts of what's going on with Europe, how the leaders who seem inept, I don't know if that's the right word, but the leaders who are leading these people down the primrose path, and the people that are like, yes, let's go right on into this meat grinder and impoverish and deindustrialize our own continent. And of course, we know in a couple months, they'll be in the street screaming at those very same leaders that gave them what they asked for, although what they were told to ask for, and then they ultimately asked for what they were told to ask for. But at any rate, your thoughts on all of that?
Yeah, no, it's a perfect example of just how it is that we have this loud paradox of just so many. I don't think we've ever had so many university graduates across the world, especially the transatlantic community, with so little capacity to identify or solve problems. Like, you would think that that's why we created schooling in the first place, was to enhance the power of the minds of young people to grow up mature and solve problems, which will always need to be solved. That's why education exists. And yet here we are producing record numbers of diplomas, high level, higher education diploma, and yet no ability to identify how self-destructive these very obvious things are. And I was listening to an interview with the current head of the IMF and Christine Lagarde, Georgieva, forgot her first name. Anyway, and they were just talking about the surprising effect of the money printing of the past several years, especially under the pandemic, and how inflation seems to be growing out of control. And they're like, we didn't realize this is one of the unexpected effects of a policy that you couldn't know was going to happen. And it's like, wait a minute, this has happened hundreds, if not thousands of times in world history, that when you print money and you destroy the means of production, money loses value, you get inflation. That's exactly what we've done to the extreme. So how did you not know that? And you're supposed to be the smartest people in the room. And like you said, we have on energy basic elementary facts that if you have a certain amount of people, like if you have a very few people living at low standards of living, like we did in the medieval ages, having wood burning as your energy source, maybe some windmills, is an okay form of technology. We had those things back then, and that was okay for that type of norm of population levels, population life expectancy, that you would have. People lived on average 38 years of age, high infant mortality. Okay, that's fine for that age. Now, if you want to take that norm from 800 years ago and then transplant that into a society which has become completely reliant upon heavy industry, certain expectations of living standards and life expectancy, it's not going to work. And yet here we are being told we have to shut down all of our hydrocarbon forms of energy. I'm not saying that we should always be on that. I don't think that that's the case. However, this is being done very radically and prematurely, that we should not only cut off all access from Russian abundant productions of natural gas and oil and coal, but on top of that, shut down what little we have left, and also shut down nuclear power on top of that, which are all supposedly just unnatural, bad for the environment, and go for windmills and burning wood from forests to stay warm, and maybe solar panels, which when you look at the quality of energy, not only is it hyper expensive, money we don't have to build these things, but the quality of energy that you get from windmills and solar panels is of such a low grade that you cannot have capital intensive industrial society maintain itself. You can only go and revert back to something we had maybe a few hundred years ago with those low level quality sources of energy that are, again, not very reliable, especially in wintertime. So the level of ignorance, of controlled ignorance, is very high and very dangerous, and it shouldn't be the case. Like, kids in grade 5, grade 6 should already be far more advanced and have more common sense than the people who seem to be, again, the smartest people in the room managing the technocracy of of the rules-based international order. It's wickedly bizarre.
Well, let me ask you this, something I know that you know about and you can enlighten us about, and that is the question about the empire. And here's what I mean. There was the British Empire, there's the US Empire, and I saw something that really made me think. When the US Empire felt threatened, the first thing they did was they created this thing called AUKUS. The US, the UK, and Australia. It was France, you're not in it. Germany, you ain't in it. No, it was the Anglo-Saxon Empire, as it were. You know what I mean? They felt threatened by the Chinese economically. That's all. It's the Chinese are going to grow enough economically that the traditional empire cannot impose its will on the world. That's what it seems to me. That it's not that the Chinese are doing anything, but they will have enough power that the US will not be able to arbitrarily impose its will on the global South, as it has always been, and extract their resources, and the empire lives good at the expense of the global South. Okay. And the first thing they did was they're like, we don't need the French, we don't need the Germans, they're not English speaking. Let's bring back this US. So my question is, the British Empire, the US Empire, did the British Empire go away? Is it still in charge of the US Empire? Is it a new empire? Talk about the British Empire, the US Empire, London, how did that work?
Yeah, it's this. The second one, it didn't go away. No empire ever voluntarily dissolves and lets its colonies go free. If that happens, it happens with a fight, and there was no fight as such after World War II. And it just so happened to be the case that America came out of that experience of the war as the only integrated whole country with the majority of the productive powers of society there. They didn't get touched by the hot part of the war. The Soviet Union, most of Europe suffered greatly, but the British Empire was existentially threatened by the policies and the vision of people like Henry Wallace, Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Dexter White, Wendell Willkie, Harry Hopkins. I mean, there's a whole network of people who are working ardently with their counterparts in China, in Russia, in India, in South America, in Brazil, to externalize, to internationalize the New Deal, basically providing the means for Tennessee Valley authorities, rural electrification projects for Africa, India, China, South America, beyond, Russia. And that would, if it had not been sabotaged, it would have, I believe, it was understood by the British grand strategists of the day that it would have negated the ability for the British maritime power, and as well the banking power, because Britain was never just a maritime physical power controlled through high finance in the city of London. If every nation was doing these things, working together in cooperation, finding their mutual win-win, like best interest was in working with their neighbors instead of against their neighbors, that's a fact. That's the way. That's good business. Then that would also involve applying certain things that had been done very well at times in the U.S. when it had sane management, usually people who were assassinated while in presidential office in the case of the USA, of protectionism, emitting productive credit for large-scale industrial projects, infrastructure. That was something applicable to every country, and many countries around the world wanted to adopt that. Kwame Nkrumah was studying in the United States, studying the Tennessee Valley Authority, and at Bretton Woods, the American delegation was fighting very hard against the British, against John Maynard Keynes, who represented the Bank of England and the idea of a one world banking currency, to support the right of all of the small former colonized countries to have full spectrum economies and stand on their own 2 feet. And they had succeeded even at dissolving the Bank of International Settlements in terms of the vote, at least at Bretton Woods. However, as we know, Roosevelt died a little bit too soon. No autopsy. His allies were all labeled red commie traitors under the new Anglo-American relationship built up by Truman and Churchill. Things like the U.S.-UK signals agreement was set up on the same day that Churchill delivered his Iron Curtain speech on March 5th, 1946. Same day. And that was the basis of the Five Eyes being created, right? The integration of the NSA into the GCHQ that same day. And this itself was really just the manifestation of what people like Cecil Rhodes had called for in his will of 1877, of a conquering of the belligerent colonies of the Americas under a new global reconfigured British Empire, maybe under a different veneer, but ultimately the same thing. So it had been a long time coming. There had been a lot of work put into doing that. FDR even wrote to his son Elliot that most of the officials within my own State Department operate for Winston Churchill. I don't trust them. I can only trust myself. He said that to his son. And
I heard the same thing about Henry Kissinger. That Nixon said the same thing about Kissinger.
I didn't know about that.
That he worked more for the British than that he answered to London rather than him.
Oh yeah, I'd like to read that. I didn't know that. I didn't know Nixon was so self-aware, because I know Kissinger on May 10th, 1981 at Chatham House, the British Roundtable or Institute for International Affairs of Britain. That's sort of the parent. For those who don't know, that's the parent think tank to the CFR, the Council on Foreign Relations inside of the United States. He delivered his famous Chatham House speech saying he sided with Churchill over FDR in terms of Churchill's view of how the world should be governed after World War II against Roosevelt's naive, stupid idea that you could support the sovereignty of all of the individual nations of the world to stand on their own 2 feet. And he said that was naive. Churchill's was much better. And he also said that he had spent more of his time as Secretary of State briefing the British Foreign Office than he did his own State Department. So the fact that Nixon was self-aware, it's interesting. I didn't know that. I know that Lyndon Johnson in his last interview, somebody had sent me the link to it, where he says that the entire time that he was the president, he felt the same guns that killed Kennedy pointed to the back of his neck, which he said he thought was tied to a CIA operation running out of the Caribbean, which was news to me. But it's an interesting leap. That Lyndon Johnson.
I heard that. God rest his soul. Paul Robeson Jr. told me the same thing. He said exactly the same thing, that it was a CIA or a group run out of the Caribbean.
Yeah, there's something there. I mean, there was Jeffrey Steinberg who had written some amazing work for EIR, had done some really good reporting on Permindex as well back in the 90s. And some of this was published, I think, first in the 80s in Dope Inc., which you probably heard of this book. It's an interesting book. And yeah, within Jeff Steinberg's research, he pulls together a certain outlet that seems to have been in the Caribbean called the Trial Club, that people like Louis Mortimer Bloomfield, who ran Permindex in Montreal, which is sort of an assassination bureau set up in World War II that reconfigured itself after the war was over and was caught, funding at least 2 of the 30 assassination attempts against Charles de Gaulle and got kicked out of France for it. And people like Fleming, the guy who created James Bond, they were all members of the Trial Club, which is like this hedonistic, weird, again, like the name says, try it all, right? Club out of the, it was somewhere in the Caribbeans, which is again tied to the mafia. It's weird. I mean, it's a conflict.
Well, let me ask you this.
Yeah.
Let's come to modern day stuff. Modern day, what's going on in Ukraine? What's interesting is I've read a lot about that, and Sergei Lavrov has said this is not just about Ukraine. This is way bigger than Ukraine. This is about changing the world. This is about, it was interesting because I see this very much. I don't know a lot about it, but I know enough to say the US empire, you can see there, the US and the West, and when I say the West, I mean the US and the Europe. Their reaction has been so over the top. It's insanity, and it's like, no, this isn't, nobody can ever do this. We have to do everything we can to stop it. And when Lavrov says, this ain't just about Ukraine, I hear him. And I see that a couple of things. I see him say this is not just about Ukraine, it's about something much bigger. I see the Chinese 100% behind the Russians. I see the US empire say to the India, come on, you're with us. And India's like, oh no, we're with the Russians. I see every African country, every Caribbean country, every Middle Eastern country, every Latin American country say, we're with the Russians, not with the US. It is very interesting. And it seems to me they know something that we in the US don't know. What is it? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, they have not been the beneficiaries, physically at least, of globalization. So I think they've got a little bit more, they're more in tune with reality and what virtue signaling liars actually are. So I think that they could see pretty clearly the Titanic that the Western transatlantic rules-based order has become. It's a giant bubble sitting upon unpayable debts that are going to be defaulted upon, that are going to have a chain reaction collapse, that are going to result in what is likely going to look similar, but on a bigger scale to the same sort of destruction of Weimar Germany, 1923, maybe mixed with a little bit of 1929 banking collapse, where because it's sort of like a weird hybrid situation today that features elements of the deleveraging of the system of 1929 and the over bloating money printing that had occurred in 1922-23 that completely devalued the Reichsmark, where people were wiping their butts with money because obviously toilet paper was selling for trillions of dollars and we were all just billionaires. So I think that these guys know, these nations know that they have been brutalized for decades, and they see that this system is running to the end of its game. And if there was no other game in town, they'd be in bad shape right now. I think they would be hard pressed to do very much. There's not a lot of wiggle room, but because, thank God, you have, especially since 2013, the advent of the Belt and Road Initiative, which has grown and blossomed with creative leaps that nobody, I don't think, really anticipated, and integrated not just, I think we're at now 145 countries to varying degrees who have signed on to join the framework of the Belt and Road Initiative, which is integrated really closely with the Eurasian Economic Union led by Russia, which itself now is being managed increasingly on the financial side by Sergei Glaziev. I think Glaziev is one of the smartest people in Russia who understand the nature of the game and what needs to be done to build a viable new system, but it's moving ahead quite fast. You have Lula da Silva saying that, if he should win the elections coming up in Brazil, that he will make the creation of an alternative currency for South America or Latin America as a whole, called the SUR, the SUR, his top priority. He's got a lot of allies who think the same way as we've seen with the tendency of, I think it's something like 6 or 7 Latin American countries who were expected to show themselves in the United States at the Summit of the Americas. They just boycotted, more than that even. Mexico just being one of the biggest economic powers, but they were joined by Bolivia and many others who all just said, no, we're not going to go. You have also Iran now calling out openly, loudly for a alternative currency for the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. All of these things are very synergistic if they're operating under the type of paradigm we've seen demonstrated to great success by China with its capacity through the Belt and Road Initiative to build miraculous mega projects, 40,000 kilometers of high-speed rail. Canada has 0. The US may be a few hundred kilometers, and it's not even high speed. These are things that China is able to build in a very highly efficient way, and it's offering these capacities to its neighbors, which is something we have not. JFK tried to do this. FDR tried, but it was never permitted from the United States to actually be provided to poor countries to have access to high tech and manufacturing. China's going ahead and doing it. So yeah, I think these countries know that there is the only one more boat that floats, and they're I think positioning themselves to be on that one, while the
I
current
think
one
that too,
melts.
that there's this Ukraine thing is kind of, I don't know if the term is metaphorical, symbolic, or whatever, because the US has made it clear this is our proxy war against Russia. This is the big one. This is the big proxy war. We're going to arm this army. We're going to have that, and then they're going to go knock Russia down, and they're getting stomped. And
Yeah.
at some point, it's going to be, they're not going to be able to spin it anymore, because the Ukrainian military simply is the Russians. When it started, I've been talking to a lot of experts for years. I work at Sputnik, and a lot of military experts, and they said the Russians have created a military that within 500 to 1,000 kilometers of their border, that strip in there, you don't want to come in there, or you're not coming out alive, and you don't want to fight them on their border. That's what they're set up to do. They've got missiles, they've got everything they need in that range, and the US empire walked right into that mousetrap. In a way, people are like, they set a trap for Russia. In a way, it's the other way around. You walked right into a fight with Russia in an area that they have been setting up to fight for the last 20 years.
Yeah.
And so now ultimately, at some point, the US is, it's funny because you could see the Russians are losing, they don't have a chance. And then the spin starts changing. Every now and then maybe they're winning. And now the spin's like, well, at some point we're going to have to bargain with the Russians. And I'm thinking to myself, the Russians don't need a bargain. They don't need an off ramp. You need an off ramp, because your countries are going to start. Is it Slovenia or Latvia? One of them, the government's already fallen. The government fell in one of these Baltic states. Bojo, he's on his way out. He's got one foot in the grave and the other on a banana peel, as far, politically speaking. Poland, the people are in the streets right now because they really don't like living like when they were still communicating with rudimentary grunts and clicks. And you can just see this thing falling apart. And at some point, I think they're going to have to crawl to Putin and say, hey, man, can you give me a break? And I think he's going to say no. Go ahead.
Man, I don't know. I know that Putin has provided a lot of outs for the West to take, and in their arrogance, their boundless arrogance, all of these opportunities of cooperation have all been ignored, or just, Putin's received a lot of spit in the face. He's taken a lot over the past 20 years, and especially, he came out in 2007 offering the West the great opportunity to build the Bering Strait rail tunnel in 2007. He tried to meet with Cheney and Bush, and he wouldn't be heard. He even offered $60 billion to build a rail through the Bering Strait to be an impetus, a driver for reindustrializing the West, which he was trying to explain. Look, you've been doing it wrong for 40 years. You've suffered. We've suffered. Let's work at building a viable economy that actually produces things again. Let's take this great, bountiful area of the Arctic, which has so much potential. We don't have to militarize it. We could work together on these mutual, because you could have a lot of resources, but if you don't have any roads or rail, it doesn't matter that the resources are there. So, and no, he couldn't be heard. He offered it once more with Obama in 2011, and again was insulted, was not spoken to, was not respected. And it's still there as far as I can tell. Putin doesn't want missiles in the Arctic the way the managers of the handlers of Biden seem to be pushing towards, which is not just the full spectrum encirclement of missiles in the south, but also in the north and also around China's perimeter in the Pacific. Despite all of that, we've continued with this New World Order script. It's like we've been committed to the same damn ivory tower script of how the New World Order should be the day the Soviet Union disintegrated. You know, it was the end of history, and everyone was full on quadrupling down on the fact that they won the world, and it's now just the question of consolidating the whatever little, you know, belligerent systems remain, and just instituting this post nation state system of control. And now all of a sudden, for the past 8 years, it doesn't work that way. They can't get their regime changes the way they used to so easily. They can't get the type of effects they used to get by just snapping their fingers, because you have Russia, China, Iran, you have increasingly India. So many countries are all together now saying, no, we're not going to take this anymore. We want a different type of future. And so I would think that Putin would still be graceful if there was some humility, some signs of humanity that could emerge from the West. Now, personally speaking, you and I sitting here in the West, having just watched the inside of this basket case insane asylum, I don't see a lot of it. I want to be surprised. I want to see some humanity again. Maybe it's there. Maybe it's up to us, you know, and those watching this show to look inside themselves and think, well, maybe I have to play more of an active role than a voyeur in maybe helping to organize a process that could awaken some humanity in positions of some form of influence. But right now, I don't know. It's
well, let me ask you this then.
Yeah.
Because I feel that what's coming, there's a storm on the horizon. There's an economic storm on the horizon, and it's going to hit. And I do believe that, you know, the Europeans want their regime change, and they're going to get it, but it ain't going to be in Moscow. We're going to see a number of governments, probably most of the governments, I believe, responsible when these people in Europe start realizing that they can't afford anything and that their standard of living has disintegrated. There's going to be some regime change. Now, let's talk about the direction things could go for this reason. What we've been told is, look, be wary of the conservative, of the right, like a Viktor Orban. They're fascist and they're bad news, and they can just wipe us out, right? Be wary of the, of those types of right wingers. They'll bring in fascism. Now, here's the reality. What we have now with the ultra liberals, if ultra nationalists are fascists, these ultra liberals are a form of fascism. And I don't know if the word fascism, we could use other words. And to be frank, and I'm a lefty of the leftist side, right? But there's a difference between ideology and sheer madness. When I look at Orban saying, wait a minute, guys, look, okay, I know you hate Russia and all that stuff, but I got to prioritize having gas and food and things like that for my population. It seems like not so much, well, he's a far right winger versus somebody who's going to be, hugging puppies, as some level of rationality versus complete madness. If we're looking at this ultra liberal form of fascism, is going in the direction, if things shift, let's say in Europe, in the directions of the kind of Viktor Orban, which is the old school non-interventionalist style conservative, right? The nationalist conservative is, to some extent, isn't that better than what we have now? Anyway, your thoughts on the direction things will go, and would that be really worse if they're like, yeah, we're kind of, we're not woke as we should be, or anything like that? The woke stuff, I hate it anyway. That's a whole nother hour to talk about. But I don't want to go to war with Russia and China tomorrow, so let's try to chill out and just at least maintain the standard of living at some reasonable levels for our population. Anyway, I know I said a lot. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, you're raising some good points. And I mean, there's many flavors of fascism, and the word gets abused quite a bit for political lens, and it's like anybody who didn't show up to Biden's democracy summit, or who wasn't invited, which was half the world, are apparently authoritarian regimes, not compatible with the ideas of the rules-based order and how the world should be in our post nation state. But more than that, post-truth age, right? Because there's a cultural dynamic to what type of reset world civilization is expected to be brought online with a certain transhuman flavor, which encourages things like the sort of thing we saw in what was it? Was it Kansas, or I forget which state? But I'd seen a video of drag your kids drag week or something
Oh
like that.
yeah, I've been seeing that. They have these drag queens come to like elementary schools. I saw one
Yeah,
where like these kids were putting dollars in like it was in a strip show kind of thing.
yeah,
And I'm
right.
like,
They were
yeah, I
taking
think
through a
we've lost it.
21. Oh yeah, exactly. And the parents were there cheering on their children
Yeah.
to walk down the catwalk with the drag strippers. And I mean, this is just over the top. This is what the like liberalism has become. This was unthinkable even 5 6 years ago, and I mean for sure 20 years ago, where most liberals who were considering themselves liberals were against wars in countries we shouldn't be in. They were against the surveillance state, and now many of these same people, just a little bit, a few years later, are doing things like this, are championing going to war with Russia, championing supplying weapons to Nazis in Ukraine, and other things that are just unimaginably over the top. And I think a lot of this has to do with the fact that what made the liberal progressive movement work was its uh, focus on empathy and having access to your feelings, to not just think with cold logic, but to think
Hmm.
also with your heart. And that's good. That's why you have a social safety net. That's why we had social security. That's why we don't let, old people who can't, support healthcare have access to medical treatments. It's because that's why these policies happened, was because we had a heart, right? We knew it wasn't all just for money, and it wasn't just the selfish motive. So that's good. And the problem was this was capitalized on, and I think inflated to the point that emotions became what, in the last few years especially, defined what truth is. And I'm sorry, that's a bad standard for defining what truth is. That you could make your own truth by having whatever type of gender you feel like. One day I feel like what, not just a man, or a man doesn't just have to feel like a woman to be a woman. He could feel like any one of the, 89 accepted genders, and it could grow to, there's no reason why you can't have 1 million genders, depending on if you feel like a couple. There's a girl in Germany who wants to marry her model toy airplane, and she really wants to marry this thing. I'm not even joking. And she's trying to change the laws of Germany to permit her to marry this toy model Boeing 747. And that's a serious thing. And the culture is taking that seriously. Instead of giving her psychiatric treatment and help, which is what you should be doing, we're treating this like it's a legitimate thing you should want and be serviced by the state. So yeah, we've gone crazy, and as soon as society, I think, loses its ability to have a metric of judging right and wrong with objective standards, you've lost the ability to avoid fascism. You will always have power structures that will capitalize on your inability to see, because if you don't believe in truth, it means you don't believe that there is a noble, that you could be lied to. You can't see an intention. Somebody could say nice things to you, but you don't know if their intention is the opposite of what they're saying, which unfortunately it obviously is. So these are candidates for total fascism under a liberal garb. And I think, yeah, people like Orban, or even, the better part of the Republican Party, which is rejecting the critical race theory stuff, because obviously you have the neocon Republicans, but then you have something which doesn't, which is not there, that rallied around Trump, who I'm generally sympathetic with. They're human beings who are not technocrats, at the very least. With all of their problems, they're human. I could see humanity there. I don't see these automaton zombie Borg-like technocrats who are governed by their their ideology. So that's a thing that is reactive.
Let me ask you this, and I don't know if you can answer this question, but I'll throw it at you. I had some people asking me, what is neoliberalism, neoconservatism, blah, blah, blah. And I put it like this, right? I kind of went back to the old Zen thing I studied Zen, where you say, I can never know who I am. Who are you? Well, my name is Garland. Okay. Could you change your name to Mike? Yeah. And that you'd still be the same. So Garland is a description of you. Tell me about, oh, I'm a carpenter, I'm a plumber, I'm a whatever. You're still describing you. What is this thing? Who is this person? And it's ineffable. No matter how many words you use, you can never really ever get to what you really are, which is fine, which is okay, right? So what I said was, look, when you say what is neoliberalism, what is neoconservatism or wokeism, there's this thing, and we may be getting close to it. It's economic policies presents as neoliberalism. its expansionist and militaristic policies presents as neoconservatism. Its cultural policies presents as wokeism. We're still talking about this ball, right? If you look at it through the lens of what culturally, what is this beast, this monster? Wokeism. That's you can see it through looking at it wokeism. It pushes wokeism. What about economics, neoliberalism, austerity, all that kind of stuff? IMF, WTO, blah, blah, blah. Oh, yeah. What about military? See this expansionism, overthrowing countries. So when they're grabbing their stuff, okay, that's this. But there's still something there. Could it be this thing that I have yet to identify that's presenting in these different ways? Is this very powerful economic / old families, old this structure that when we start talking about the Bilderbergs, when we start talking about Chatham House, when we start talking of going back to Cecil Rhodes, when we start going back to this kind of London Wall Street, names like Cabot Lodge and DuPont and these kind of names start coming up. Could that be that this is what we're talking about that's presenting itself, that's hidden, this hidden monster that presents itself as neoconservatism or neoliberalism or wokeism?
Yeah. Yeah. No,
Let me know
mean,
if I'm going to make it even making sense.
Yeah, you are. I know, absolutely. I get it. I mean, I think that in our world, there's a lot of people get confused, I think, around the utilization of terms. And I mean, nominalism is a dangerous thing sometimes, where people think that the truth is located in the definition of the word you're using.
Right.
And so they have all of these presumptions and prejudices that they bring to the word that you say. And sometimes you could be talking to somebody using in the same words, and it takes maybe 30, 40 minutes or longer before you realize, wait, we're talking about two different worlds. Like, we're using the same words, but our thoughts are totally different. And so there's got to be a rectification of terms, as Confucius said, in order for us to, I think, proceed. And so I think what underlines all of these different aspects of empire today, because obviously there's a neoconservative component to it. There's a neoliberal. We see a convergence of these things that seem to have certain more opposition a little while ago, but not really, because as soon as George Bush Sr. was out, after all of the damage that he caused, being a part of this sort of neoconservative awakening, with people like Newt Gingrich and others, people like Zbigniew were spearheading this thing back in the 70s with Team B and other people like Paul Nitz, who was an early Bilderberger member, founding member with Kissinger and others. And so you had this weird thing that metastasized in the Republican Party. It selected the Republican Party as its host. It took a little while for it to fully take over the host. Mm-hmm. And we saw the effects of this thing in Desert Storm and in a variety of things that Bush Sr. had done. And then people thought, oh, now we got something different with Bill Clinton in 92. And all of a sudden we had this massive flux of Rhodes Scholars, people like Strobe Talbot,
yes,
and Robert Reich, and all of these Oxford Rhodes Scholars all of a sudden just infused themselves into the White House. And people somehow got this sense
Rice.
of Susan Rice. Yeah.
Monsters. Most of them are monsters.
Absolutely. They're and so it was a very ill-placed sense of relief as we saw that the technique just shifted gears a little bit, where the neocons had their own view of what the New World Order should be, as far as a characteristic of the US being the dominant power over the world, and being the world policeman as the single hegemon, with the United Nations and everything else being subservient to the USA as the power center, the police. That came out in the Project for New American Century very clearly.
And they're very brutal.
Very brutal. Very
neocons. They don't, some of the other people wanted to use a scalpel. These people use a sledgehammer. They're extremely brutal. Whereas you have other elements that try to finesse their way. They want to paint a Picasso and get in charge. These people want to take a D9 bulldozer, put it in first gear, and just flatten everything in their way.
Yeah. And that's where I think that the to be able to understand the controlled opposition of the seeming left and seeming right, that are both very controlled systems, is to see that the left, which was also the Democratic Party, was also infused and taken over like a host being taken over by a virus. It's not the same Democratic Party by 1990 that you had with JFK, right, or his brother Bobby. There was
Right.
an infusion and a takeover. It happened here in Canada with our parties too, and you can map out how the Fabian Society, which sort of is a more left elitist think tank operating out of the London School of Economics, and it operates as sort of the mirror image, but whereas the Rhodes Scholar movement operated out of Oxford, doing fundamentally the same thing, indoctrinating young talent for the next generation to be the upper level managers, to infiltrate and permeate. However, at least before World War II, it was more clear this left and right, where the round table tended to be more right wing appealing. They respected responded, like when you look at people like Lord Milner or Lord Halifax or Philip Kerr, they were a little bit more of the old school, like smite the savages, subvert and just destroy, burn the earth type of doctrine of get everyone to submit to the superior Anglo-Saxon race of the pure British people. And the Fabians, people like H.G. Wells, Julian Huxley, John Maynard Keynes, and others, they were like, no. Let's be more patient. Let's take the Fabian approach, right? Attrition. That was the Fabius Maximus approach of the Roman general. You defeat your armies, you defeat Hannibal by pulling them into attrition, get them to waste away, and then when they're weak, then you strike. So just you might not see it in your lifetime, but just wait, okay? And the round table approach, the more brutalized approach, was tried a few times with World War I. It was tried with World War II. It didn't work. It created Frankenstein monsters that were unwieldy to their upper level managers in London. And Hitler realized at a certain point, wait a minute, why am I going to be the junior partner of the New World Order when I have all of this economic and military power? I could be the guy running the show, and Britain could be my junior partner. And some British people, like the King of England, Edward VIII, was happy to go along with that. Many were. Others were not so much. They wanted to stay in the driver's seat, and so he had to be put down like the Frankenstein he was, or the Frankenstein monster. And a new strategy was then put into play after World War II, using the Fabian Society technique and the Roundtable movement, the Rhodes Scholarship Trust Fund babies. They all were sort of absorbed into a more of a collaborative relationship with the Fabians. So they began infiltrating everything they could in the private sector, corporate media, intelligence agencies. They had already been doing it, but they really accelerated. And the Democratic Party had their host, that was one host, the Republican its other. They each had their own characteristic, and we saw that express itself with two different approaches to the New World Order that were being championed by George Bush Sr., Kissinger, Strobe Talbot, Biden, How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the New World Order, all 1992, Bill Clinton saying the same thing. And it's just that they were a little bit more sophisticated in some ways, the liberal side. Let's do it with a smiling face, And
right. Well, if I could ask you one quick before we go, because we've been on an hour, but I do want to ask you one more thing, and that's and I think it's important because we've been talking about the Rhodes Scholars, and you start looking at the Rhodes again. You start looking at Clinton. You start looking at Susan Rice, and what happened was there was a new vocabulary introduced to us, wherein a new paradigm, wherein we were supposed to view a person with a Rhodes Scholar as the ultimate intellectual. You know what I mean? They introduced that paradigm where they were like, well, so-and-so, and they're a Rhodes Scholar. And everybody was supposed to go, oh, well, I guess we got to vote for that. My God, a Rhodes Scholar. Why didn't you just tell me? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that paradigm was put on people so that when they started running Rhodes Scholars for president, or they nominated this Rhodes Scholar to be in whatever position, then we were all supposed to be in awe and say, well, they're a Rhodes Scholar. They got to be in there. What the hell's up with this whole Rhodes Scholar situation? Who are these people? What created them? And what do we need to know about them?
Okay, well, it was I'll try to do this in like 2 minutes. Basically, when Cecil Rhodes died, he was a major diamond magnate, racist, a genocidalist. He managed the first Boer War to destroy the Transvaal uprising in the South Africa. He created De Beers, many other major mineral and mining cartels that are still to this very day controlling many of the resources of Africa. 70% of Africa's resources are controlled by mining corporations that are on the London Stock Exchange, based with headquarters in the Commonwealth of Britain, which is still 22% of the world territory is the Commonwealth. which is about the exact same thing as the British Empire was before it so-called dissolved. So it's really the same economic empire that it ever was. So Cecil Rhodes was the guy who created a lot of these institutions, and combining with certain financial resources, both his own ill-begotten gains, his own pile of money, as well as some Rothschild money. He composed several wills that laid out a manifesto for how a new secret society should be organized, which would have an aspect of a scholarship fund to reorganize the entire civil service of the British Empire and create fifth columns in all parts of the world, because the British Empire of his time was falling into disarray. Its civil service was untrustworthy. The nation states of the world were going with Abraham Lincoln's program for protectionism, large-scale infrastructure development, rail development, Russia, Japan, Otto von Bismarck's Germany, South America, the Drago Plan. I mean, all of the nations of the world were beginning to learn that they didn't have to stay obedient to the City of London and British maritime controls of trade. They could
No wonder they had to kill Lincoln. No wonder they had to kill Lincoln.
From Canada. That's where John Wilkes Booth was deployed from British operations in Canada. Wow. That was a Confederate, Confederate intelligence basing operation, was Montreal. It still is. Also what killed Kennedy. And again, Garfield, as well as McKinley, as well as McKinley's vice president, which allowed for Theodore Roosevelt to be brought in, who created the first wave of the Anglo-American alliance, the special relationship. Warren Harding, as well, not through Canada, but still, oyster poisoning. So you got a lot of American presidents that did not live through their terms in office. And when you look at what they're all doing politically, what's the policy that they're invoking? It's the thing that Cecil Rhodes and his handlers had nightmares about. So the Rhodes Scholarship Program was created and managed by the Trust, with partially a set of think tanks that were created called the Round Table. Eventually they changed their name and became the Council on Foreign Relations, the Chatham House, the Royal Institute for International Affairs in Britain. Canadian, Australian, South African, New Zealand operations were set up in the 20s and 30s, all to coordinate the Five Eyes, the reconquering of the US, the undoing of the American Revolution. And there's been about, I think, 3,500 US young people who have been processed through Oxford. People like Yandell Elliott, who was an early recruiter. He was himself an early Rhodes Scholar in America, who recruited Zbigniew Brzezinski, Henry Kissinger, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, Dean Rusk. I mean, there's a whole bunch of people who then became Rhodes Scholars. They were sort of tapped, given the treatment if they had the stomach for it and the talent and the lack of morality that they were willing to let go of. They were brought back into positions of influence to carry out a sort of religious-like grand design that that was awoken in their hearts. So it's kind of like a cult. It's a cult. It gave meaning to their life. And I think ultimately there's a satanic element when you start digging into it. Personally, I start seeing that there's something really nasty in terms of Bohemian Grove and some of the other ritualistic types of weird things that you see going on. But ultimately, though, they're really trying to turn back time. They want to bring humanity back. I guess this is how we began our interview, so a good way to end it. Ultimately, they're motivated by an idea of making eugenics, basically retooling eugenics, the science of population control, the weeding out of the unfit, for a pure type of new species of humankind controlled by a master class. That was retooled after World War II under a few different veneers. Transhumanism became one of the veneers, created by Julian Huxley in 1956 and Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, who worked very closely together to create this new synthetic religion for the elite and one for the masses. That's part of what animates the Fourth Industrial Revolution, this whole, we're going to integrate with machinery and CRISPR tech in order to stay relevant from AI and stuff that Elon Musk pushes. So they're all, it's part of this is just to create a very docile population of low quality thinking people who are highly mediocre, who don't believe in truth, who are willing to just ultimately go along with whatever the elites tell them that they should believe in, as far as shadows on the cave wall, believe in your that's called metaverse, by the way, and drugs.
Yeah.
And
I just call it the current thing.
The current thing.
Yeah, they go along with the current thing.
Yeah.
You know
That's
that, you know, it's the current thing now when they give you an emoji for your social media. When they give you like a flag and an emoji for your social media account,
yeah.
you know that's the new current thing.
That's yeah, exactly. And we won't notice. We won't notice that we're going all soylent and green. We won't ask what this new food is that the state is giving us.
Right.
Um, and uh, and ultimately, it's a technocratic feudalism. They want to just have us acquiesce to our own um, return back to a state we used to have maybe 800 years ago with but a few different technological modifications. And again, thank God for Russia, China, other countries of Eurasia who are not having it. That gives me a lot of hope and makes me happy, despite the fact that we are going into a bit of a storm and it's going to test our mettle quite a bit.
Yeah, I agree. I'm glad I talked to you because very few people, in one of the things I think that's interesting and very telling, and that is that America has portrayed the Lincoln assassination as one angry madman who
Hmm.
went and shot Lincoln and ran. There were 5 people hanged. It was a major conspiracy. They tried to kill his entire cabinet that night. You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
and American history is John Wilkes Booth. Climbed down and tried to shoot him. And the history books don't even show that there were 5 people, including a woman, that were hanged, that it was a major conspiracy. And they tried to kill his entire cabinet. And I always felt, yeah, that business about the Intercontinental Railroad and some other things that he was trying to do, his economic policies were, on top of the idea that he said, yeah, I think slaves should eventually be able to vote. I think that also told them how he viewed the other countries.
Yeah.
And one of the things that he said was, let's take some of the slaves that want to go back and we'll send them back to Africa, but we will economically develop the place we're sending them to. Whoa, all of these things are huge problems.
Yes. Oh man, no, I got really angry when we should have known this in elementary school. Like this it would make history class so much more interesting and rich. I didn't care about history because it's treated in such a boring, bland, memorize these facts, and the facts aren't even true when you dig at them. But if they showed us this drama and the way that things were moving as a trajectory that was then subverted, you'd get kids so much more interested, and it would make them so much more mature and wise to see the replication of foolish ideas in their own world that they would not tolerate, which is obviously why history is such a battleground right now over who controls the narratives, the models of what accounted for different wars, peace movements, other things. It's a huge fight.
It certainly is. Well, thanks a lot, Matt Ehret. Man, I hope to get you back on again sometime. It sounds like we got a lot to talk about.
Yeah,
Sounds
anytime.
like we got a good
This is fun.
time. And I've got shows around. I got a show now, and I've got my Pacifica shows, one in Washington, D.C. I got one in Los Angeles. So I'll have to get you on my radio shows and really freak the people. But you know what? Let me say this before I go. You know what is interesting? And a lot of people tell me I'm a little bit of a different guy. I was on Fox News for years. I was mainstream news guy. I had a TV show in New York, when under the Fox, I walked away. I was in mainstream news. I just walked away from all of it because I'm not reading a teleprompter, and I like, this stuff is not real. I'm out of here. Right. And what's interesting is that my radio shows in Pacifica, right? And here's what's interesting. And I want you to hear this. When the Ukraine war started, and I just talked about the reality of what it was, simple stuff like, the hell do you think the United States would do if the Russians were pumping weapons into Mexico? We'd go to war, right? And just simple logic, right? The first week or two, people called in, you're a Russian bot, a Russian puppet, a Putin lover, blah, 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 right? Yeah. It changed. And now you know what people call in Los Angeles and in DC. Thanks a lot, Garland. Keep doing what you're doing. You're telling the truth. I do believe people are starting to wake up. I think with the things that I see, I think it happened during COVID. I think COVID was a big thing. And a lot of people woke up and started to wake up. And I think there is a movement going on of people that are just starting. And what's interesting is it's not just people on the right. There are people like that I totally disagree with ideologically that I'm like tight with now, because we're both like, oh, this is a whole bunch of bullshit now here. We got to, you know what I mean? We got to live in the real world. These people are liars and frauds.
Well, see, that's the thing. Like, just as we have convergence of the psychopaths who seem to be on different sides, we were talking about left and right, but they're actually converging all in the same feudal, dystopic world order. At the same time as you have that, you have a convergence of people who are still have access to their moral compass. They just they have access to basic common sense, and we're seeing so many people who thought they were on the left, who thought they were on the right, and ultimately they're human beings first, and they know that they want to preserve their nation. They want to be able to feed their kids. They don't want to live in a dictatorship for the next several generations of dark age. And I see awakening too. I mean, my website has been exploding with activity over the past couple of years, especially. It had gone dormant for a couple of years. That's actually one thing. I got a little demoralized when Obama was still in, and I basically just stopped my Canadian Patriot website. I set it up in 2012, and by 2015, I just said, there's no point in doing this. And I kept it going, but there was no change. I didn't add any material for 2 years. And I decided one day to look at the dashboard, and just see, okay, well, what's going on? This is like Trump has now been in there for a few months, and it was blowing up. Like, I had like 800 people showing up every day, and I wasn't doing anything. I wasn't trying to put new material out. So what I realized was the script broke, right? The New World Order script, even though Trump had all sorts of problems,
Right.
I can accept that. But
he wasn't one of them.
He wasn't one of them. No, and no one's going to tell me they wanted him in and they didn't want Hillary in. No, they wanted Hillary in. But it demonstrated that there is something viable inside of the USA which was capable at this late stage of the game to still break a script that way. And it was a boost for me. It gave me a lot of energy to say, okay, if people are hungry, let's actually feed. And it's going to feed me too in so doing. And then with the whole 2 years of COVID insanity and everything else, that's been an increased accelerated boost of people who were complacent. And all of a sudden now the fire, they could feel it. So you have a lot of people now searching for water. So there's definitely a move towards truth and hunger for it. And I think it just needs to be tightened up in terms of solution orientation. There's not that
Right.
leadership you need to have to give it the type of coherence it needs to do battle with the type of highly centralized, organized enemy structure that we currently have managing the international deep state, which is a very highly centralized thing.
Yeah.
So you'd have to have
Malcolm X said,
Huh?
Malcolm X said, you got to wake people up first. He
Yes.
said, before you can do anything, you got to wake people up first. And I think that's where we are. I appreciate you coming on. I'm talking with Matthias Desmond. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He does the what is it? Mass formation. I think it's very important to understand that.
Agreed.
So I'm talking with him and his people, and I hope to get him on next month. But anyway, thanks a lot, Matt. Ehret, where can people find you?
Oh, yeah, right. So they can go to CanadianPatriot.org. That's updated every day with new material. Also, RisingTideFoundation.net. I manage that. It's more educational, cultural focused that I work with my wife on that platform. My book series on the Clash of the Two Americas, or the Untold History of Canada series, they could pick that up on the Canadian Patriot website. That's pretty good. That's quite a bit of material there.
All right, thanks very much. And for those who can't see my T-shirt, it actually says "Action for Assange." I'm a big Julian Assange, free Assange, free Assange. Got to lead with that. Thank you very much, Matt. Hope to have you on again soon, man. Have a great night, and certainly appreciate it. I'm sure everybody enjoyed it.
Bye.
All righty. That was Matt Ehret. See, I told you guys it would be awesome. It was going to be a lot of fun. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to share this with all of your friends on all of your platforms. And let people know about this show and let people listen to it. We need to try to start waking people up to what they're up against. I certainly appreciate it and what we need to do. Also, make sure you go to my Rockfin channel, ROKFIN, rockfin.com/Garland Nixon. Look in the show notes. You'll see my Rockfin stuff, because you never know when they're going to throw me off of YouTube. And I want everybody on YouTube to also be subscribe to my Rockfin channel. You can, if you want to become a member, it's $9.99 a month. I would appreciate that. That allows you to see premium stuff. But if you can't afford it, don't worry about it. I understand. You can just become a subscriber for free. My Patreon information, my Patreon page is in the show notes. Also, PayPal, that's in the show notes. My email address, garlandin@gmail.com. Certainly, I appreciate everybody coming on. Wow, 342 people. Smash that like button. I should have 342 likes for sure. Share this. If you're watching this on Twitter, make sure you go to my YouTube and my Rockfin page also and become a subscriber. Thanks a lot, everybody. Have a great night. Garland, you should go on Jimmy Dore. I've been on Jimmy Dore a couple of times. Haven't been on there for a while. Heartening to see young people smart thinking. Man, that guy's. Let me tell you something. For those of you who haven't seen Matt, you just even scratched the surface with this guy. He really knows his stuff. So I'm doing my best, everybody, to try to bring on really good guests. Matthias Desmet, if you haven't heard of him, he does this thing, talks about this thing called mass formation. He's absolutely brilliant. You really need to hear that. Basically, what Matthias Desmet talks about is how they get all of us to believe something, how we kind of get into a mass psychosis, a mass hypnosis. And he talks about how that happened during COVID. He talks about how that happens and ways that it can be broken out of. So Matthias Desmet is absolutely awesome. We'll get him on. Matt Ehret, awesome. I'm working to get some people that really know their stuff on here. So, you know, we can have some fun. We can laugh and joke, but we can get some serious work done. Thanks a lot, everybody. Peace. I'm out.